This has to be the first Iron Culture presented by Mass episode where all of Mass is here to actually present Iron Culture. Am I right?
I believe so.
At least in person. Because we have had one or two other episodes of all four of us, yes?
Yeah, indeed.
Well, folks, we are here at the Sports Nutrition Annual Conference, and we're here in lovely Austin, Texas. You know what? Tacos, live music, hotel room podcast. That's what it's known for, right? And I just have to say, it warms the cookies in my heart to be here with all of you. And I mostly said that just to make Zourdos a little angry, because that's when I like Zourdos at his best, when he's angry at me. But in all seriousness, this is pretty cool. We have been having a whole day of Mass, recording reels, talking about the future, thinking about where we want to go and how we can bring cool content, and also potentially launching a sister podcast.
Yeah. So yeah, we got another podcast concept that we're cooking up. We've recorded episodes, so it will exist. And it's going to be part of the extended Mass Multimedia Empire universe. And so this new podcast concept, Warren steers the ship. I don't know why I'm talking about it, but it is going to be called Front Page Fitness. And it's going to be different than Iron Culture. A lot of people have told me it's going to be frankly better than Iron Culture. And if it's possible, we have the right team in place to do it, but I'm not convinced. We'll see what the people think once the episodes get out. But yeah, so Front Page Fitness, it's named that by design. We're going to be talking about headlines, controversies, and stuff that's basically in the news, being chattered about on social media. So it's not necessarily going to be really, really, really detailed, in the weeds, deep dives of specific papers, but more so, for example, a few weeks back, a couple months back, there's a lot of chatter about alcohol and whether or not a tiny bit of alcohol is good for you, bad for you, or maybe neither. And it was getting making a ton of headlines in lay press publications, a lot of chatter on social media. So we tackle that and lean on the evidence without giving a 45-minute dissertation on the topic. And Warren obviously she is kind of the primary curator of the news we bring in. And as a bit of a shot across the bow, in one of our early episodes, Lauren actually presented a headline about none other than Florida Man. So it was a bit of a shot across the bow at Zourdos. But Warren, do you mind filling people in on what Florida Man is up to?
Praise only, please.
Florida Man is endless fodder for good times and humiliating stories across the board. And he entered the health and fitness space by going on a carnivore diet in which he ate 6 to 9 pounds of cheese, ground beef, mostly in burger form, and butter, and
multiple sticks of
butter per day.
Per day.
Per day.
Impressive, though.
And
very impressive.
Yeah, the 6 to 9 pounds of cheese is cheese alone per day.
Per day.
Allegedly, according to the Journal of the American Medical Association. That is published.
This is a published case study because he presented to the hospital in Florida with cholesterol leaking out of his hands. So the headline was, Florida Man leaks cholesterol.
Florida Man, cholesterol hands.
Yes. So we had a pretty lengthy discussion about how one consumes 6 to 9 pounds of cheese. And we said, yeah, on the burger, that makes sense. But do you melt it? Do you do a fondue? Trek suggested a cheese whiz.
Yeah, that's a Midwestern staple. And when you whiz cheese, that's the processing term. When you whiz it, it really allows for greater volume of consumption. So if you were really going for a PR, you would not want to do like an aged Vermont cheddar. That's a very dense cheese. You want to reduce that density so it goes down easy.
But I think 1 can of Cheese Whiz is a few ounces. So if we're going to get to 6 to 9 pounds, that's a case of
multiple cases maybe.
Yeah.
Yeah. listen, I think that what you guys are doing in your new venture, in this new podcast, is very important, perhaps more important than what's being done on Iron Culture presented by Mass, because it's bringing the issues of the day that are out there in the news to the people. And something like Florida Man, cholesterol hands, what really needs more coverage than that? I can't think of a whole lot. I'm sure maybe in episode 2, 3, 4, you guys will get to other headlines that are close to as worthy, but probably not as worthy. But if you want some more content, come visit me sometime. I'll drive you around our great state, and we can check out Florida Man, cholesterol hands, Florida men, perhaps even Florida woman.
No, it's not a thing.
You sure? How about in the Gulf of America if I take you over to the coast?
In the water?
The Panhandle.
Yeah. So
You may find Florida woman in the Panhandle.
that's where she may be.
Yeah.
We do also cover someone who ate 30 raw eggs per day for a month.
Yeah, a month.
Well,
It's just the egg whites. Oh, this wasn't about Mangs. Oh, okay. Got it.
You're in episode 9. You come up. Some
Oh,
of
we
you.
got it.
Yeah, and actually, that story got really intriguing because there was some betrayal involved due to the severe gastrointestinal ramifications
of the 30 raw eggs.
of 30 raw eggs.
You don't say.
There was some conflict in the home. Interpersonal relationships were challenged by that, and that really, in my opinion, was the true story behind that particular experiment. Was
We deep dived their relationship.
it was mostly about their relationship, their reconciliation, and whether or not things might still be on the rocks, and we're not really sure. So we're going to have to do more investigative work on that.
Yeah.
I do have a question. Why did the cholesterol specifically come out of his hands, though?
Oh, would Florida Man cholesterol feet sound good? No. Florida Man cholesterol hands.
Are you suggesting that it's just a media manipulation of what actually happened?
Media would
There
never
were
do
pictures
that.
of him
Media would never do that.
in the Journal of
The American.
American Medical Association.
So,
This is a legitimate medical condition.
okay, so something about the hands and maybe their propensity of sweating, or perhaps the amount.
You
Of
can get
expansion.
cholesterol feet as well.
Yeah, so this is a medical condition that is not always tied to eating 6 to 9 pounds of allegedly whizzed cheese per day. There are some instances where people on fairly conventional diets, just due to genetic predisposition, will get this. Usually they do have hypercholesterolemia. And what you'll find is that there will be these little nodules, little cholesterol deposits on the hands, sometimes on the elbows, feet, sometimes a little bit on the face as well. So there are multiple areas where this can happen. But in this particular case study, what's so interesting about it is there's really no reason to believe that there's any kind of familial link to it. Basically, what happened was this individual had kind of borderline high cholesterol, then initiated this carnivore diet, and their cholesterol went from in the low 200s to over 1,000 in the course of adhering to this diet, and
And he felt great.
he felt great.
Of course, sure. I mean,
So yeah, but yeah, I did look this up.
He
So
lost weight.
oh, that's number one.
yeah,
That's number one. Listen,
Through his hands.
yeah. Well, I mean, listen, in unless we go by one of our old articles, spot reduction might not be a thing, which means that if he was in Florida, specifically if he was even in South Florida, he's just getting ready for summertime, which in South Florida is all the time. So who can really fault what he's doing? It's driven by the societal pressure in South Florida to be ready for the beach. And if he could lose weight doing that, I see no reason not to discuss this as a potentially viable strategy for others to undertake.
Or at the very least, discuss the body image pressures that people get from the physique focus of South Florida.
Indeed. Listen,
now I will say this. So it's probably should have led with this, but when I first read about this whole case study, I thought, are we looking at a man who's certainly going to die soon, if not immediately?
Is he still alive today?
So I actually haven't checked that, but I did look and say, listen, if we are going to be if we're going to have a lighthearted romp through this topic, I'd like to know a little bit more about the risk profile specifically associated with this development of cholesterol-rich nodules on the hand and other superficial areas. And I am pleased to say that the reason the show will go on, first of all, the show must go on, but second of all, it's actually not like this direct relationship where it's like, bro, when your cholesterol gets that high, clearly you're looking at a cardiovascular major event in the next 6 months. The epidemiology is actually far less dire than I expected. So we can move forward, joke about various cheese eating challenges, question the physics of how, if the burger is a delivery mechanism, how much beef do you have to eat to get 6 pounds of cheese within and still call it a burger rather than some kind of like cheese melt or like beef casserole. But we get into all that stuff while knowing that actually this isn't as dire as it seems on the surface. But it is a cautionary tale that, hey, folks, get your blood lipids done every now and then. Eat diets that, may be a little bit more advisable than that, and try to keep your cholesterol safely under 1,000. Yeah.
I think it's good to know that there are mechanisms in the body to lower cholesterol even when you are on a 6 to 9 pound cheese diet. One of them being, hand-based excretion of cholesterol, which is potentially a new mechanism that maybe we consider as a drug target. Like, can we just increase cholesterol excretion in the hands in everyday people? Like, we have these supposedly effective drugs from Big Pharma, but what if there's a supplement that could just help me shoot cholesterol out of my hands like I was some type of fast food Iron Man?
Perhaps it would also be a weight loss drug based on what we just talked about. So you're killing two birds with one stone.
And we need to work on that with alcohol as well. I think a lot of people do know intuitively that if you really put your mind to it and drink hard enough, your body will excrete alcohol unmetabolized, right? You do not extract those calories when you reach those physiological heights that you are just kind of dumping it out through sweat and breathing it out, et cetera.
In there.
Yes, absolutely. And so that's another target I'm interested in, is like, how do we create the kind of virtually calorie-free whiskey-heavy diet? Because living in North Carolina, home of moonshining, I feel like that would be a big deal for us.
Let's put some students on it.
I think that there's definitely some potential theses here. And from a bodybuilding perspective, this may cross different nutrients. I think a better way to set protein targets is at what point are you excreting undigested protein through your hands? And then we go...
Or other things.
Or wherever. And then it's maybe 1 gram below that is the universal target for everyone. Okay. So maybe that's 986 versus 987 grams of protein per day.
Yeah, if you're competing in a pageant, you would need that. That's good. We are really giving out, I think, a lot of good, solid recommendations for people to use and for people to take on.
Yeah.
But I have to say, there's one thing that in the discussion of Florida Man Cholesterol Hands, we talked a little bit about his physical appearance. And that is really hitting home for me because we've been together here for the first time ever for today. And it's been, I'm going to say, an okay day for me. Because just as Florida Man Cholesterol Hands had his appearance questioned, I have had my appearance talked about all day today by everybody in this room. And it's been hurtful. It's things like, for the audience, the shape of my head have been discussed. Right?
The way that the window is, so the light's coming from here.
You're getting a lot of glare off the weird part.
From my angle, so I actually thought you didn't...
Flat part.
Florida Man.
Here's the weird... I actually thought you didn't have eyebrows. But now that the sun's actually going through it, I can see that they're just blonde.
Fine. Can you ask the questions?
Yeah. So the show. What we're going to get into today is effective science communication. We thought we would have some pretty clear dovetails into that.
Since we're communicating so effectively.
Right. Yeah.
It's going great. Yeah. Yeah, I'm ready.
So I think we've made, honestly, more effective segues than we needed to get to this. But we thought, what's a topic that all four of us could talk about? And we started with one that all three of us could talk about that you were not happy about. And now we're gonna loop you in, and we're gonna talk about science communication.
Oh, I need to check my email, see if HR wrote me back for my complaint this morning. I'll be right back.
I did get it, and we're on it.
I just can't wait for the outcome.
Launching a full investigation.
Yeah. I don't know if you knew this, but we had a vote in the HR department, which was me previously, that we did need an independent second person on HR.
Yeah.
And I said, Lauren, do you mind also
Including
doing this?
the individual that made the comments about my
This is anonymous. As I discussed with you many times, Mike, we don't use names under HR
okay.
because we need to keep the anonymity and the confidentiality of the claimants so that they can have the freedom and the open space that we've created here in Mass to discuss things.
It's fine.
Good. So we're just going to remove that complaint. He said it's fine. So now we're going to loop you into the conversation, and I think we want to talk about something that's in all of our wheelhouses. So it's not, say, physiology and metabolism. It's not women's health specifically. It's not real sports that involve barbells, nor is it...
What do you do again?
I don't know.
I try not to do a whole lot, if I'm being honest. I go by the George Costanza theory, which is I always just look annoyed.
You do look very busy.
People think you're busy.
Yeah, and it's working.
As I've sold it well.
You've also given us a company stance that we got to be on.
Yeah.
So with that said, I think one thing that all of us do, I love it, is discuss science. And to be serious for a moment, I think we are in a phase of the world, frankly, the information age, where it's no longer this lack of information. Mm-hmm. It's this oversaturation of information. And it is, everyone appears, at least to most, to be an expert. And despite we having so many experts and so much information, the opinions about things are incredibly diverse. So clearly science is not being communicated effectively. Additionally, sometimes when people do communicate science, they do so in such a narrow framing that it seems like it is the only way, the truth and the light, and it must be done under very narrow precepts. So I thought it would be useful, since we have people who are professional science communicators here, and we all have different angles, and we have seen different problems, and we have different passions, to talk about that. So, Mike, something that was actually very instrumental in my personal development as not only a researcher and a practitioner, but also the science communicator, came from something that you've said to me a lot, is that we're not interested in the specific findings in a study, if it's an applied study, especially in exercise science, but what is the general concept, and then how do we integrate it into practice?
Yeah, it's first of all, I'm glad that something that I said has been able to impact you, because literally nothing that you said has impacted me. So that means our interactions have been meaningful in the correct way that I would have anticipated.
Unidirectional.
So I'm glad that you're able to take that from it and hold on to it all these years. So good for you. Now, this is something that I think has been really important over the years, and I've really tried to utilize, which is when we find something, especially in a study that compares training program A to training program B, right? The likelihood of seeing a difference is going to be pretty low, especially in the underpowered studies that we have in these applied studies in exercise physiology. And so what I'm really doing here is just thinking of a concept and integrating that concept into the bigger picture. So there's a few specific examples of this. I'll kind of start at the origin of this for me, and then I want to give a second example after that. So you reminded me of this earlier today, Eric, and that's when I did my dissertation back when I was just a young fellow, although I'm still younger than some people here. The study that I did was looking at two different models of daily undulating periodization, or what I would probably now call daily undulating programming. And within these models, the only thing that we were looking at was essentially the distribution of training volume and fatigue throughout the week, and how that might lead to being able to accumulate more volume and potentially greater long-term gains. And so we looked at training weeks over the course of 6 weeks that had one hypertrophy session, one strength session, and one power session. So think of the hypertrophy session being the highest volume, the most fatiguing, a power being explosive, and the strength being higher load for lower reps. And we had two groups. One group performed the hypertrophy training session on Monday. One group performed the strength session on Wednesday, and one group performed the power session on Friday. So when you think of that, hypertrophy Monday, strength Wednesday, that's only a 48 hours rest. And they were only doing the main exercises, squat, bench press, and deadlift. So you do a bunch of reps on squat and bench press on Monday. Then you turn around and you do a bunch of heavy loading on squat and bench press on Wednesday. You're going to be pretty fatigued. So we said our experimental model is going to compare to that model, and the other group is going to do hypertrophy Monday, power Wednesday, and strength Friday. The theory being now you're comparing 96 hours of rest, not rest because you're doing power, but it's light and explosive, 96 hours of recovery, if you will, from hypertrophy to strength. They should be able to get more volume or lift a heavier load on that strength day than if they just did hypertrophy, then strength 48 hours later. So a 96-hour distribution between the two hardest days and a 48-hour distribution. And what we found in that study is the individuals did perform more volume and have a little bit of a higher load they were lifting, and it did lead to more strength gains. Now, what you reminded me of, Eric, is I would often say at that time was nobody should take this and go out and say, we found the magic way to train, right? This is it. We're going to use this order, and that's end all be all. It's possible that I compared the two worst models of daily undulating programming that could exist. I don't think that's the case, but it is a possibility. And the point of making that statement is to say, this isn't even a periodization study. Well, it's 6 weeks. No 6-week study is really a periodization study. All it is a way to look at how you're allocating your programming throughout the week. And if you're in such a heavy state of fatigue, and I think it's important to note this is for strength specifically. I can't say this would be the same for hypertrophy. And I think that's a whole nother question of if you were to perform hypertrophy or you perform session on back-to-back days and you were still fatigued, but you could still accumulate the volume, would that relate to a less hypertrophy over the long run than spreading those sessions out? I don't know. But this is a way to say that if you manage that fatigue so you're not sacrificing the load you're lifting on your strength day, you're then going to likely lead to greater strength gains over the long term. So if you understand that concept, you don't have to use daily undulating periodization or linear periodization or block periodization. It's whatever you do, pay attention to how you're allocating that volume. Even things like your exercise selection. You're going to train the lower body on Monday, Wednesday, Friday. You have your heavy squats on Friday. It probably doesn't make the most sense to do RDLs, a long muscle length exercise on Wednesday, only 48 hours before. That's a session where you might want to utilize some other exercises that aren't going to be as fatiguing, cause as much damage that bleeds into the next session. I take that concept from my daily undulating programming study. So I look at what it's showing me conceptually and I see how I can integrate it into everything else. My second example I wanted to give was, I think this tide has changed on this over the past few years. People are understanding this a bit more. Primarily, we've written about it in mass. There's been a couple longitudinal studies on this now, and that's the concept of what I would call time-efficient training strategies. I've heard a lot of people refer to them as advanced training techniques, but I call them time-efficient training strategies, which we have a free guide on that you and I wrote, Eric.
We did.
On the massresearchreview.com. You can find it on there. And I think of these studies, I talk about things like rest pause sets and drop sets and supersets. So I think there used to be this kind of aura around them. Is there some sort of magic associated with drop sets or rest pause sets? What is this doing? Is a rest pause sets causing this fatigue and they're accumulating lactate and accumulating these metabolites? And is that leading to some magic gains? And what we kind of know is that over the long term, from the available data, that there isn't a difference between doing traditional sets and agonist-antagonist paired supersets, or traditional sets and drop sets, or rest pause sets, and long-term gains for hypertrophy and strength. But what it's showing us is those are time-efficient strategies, the ways to accumulate volume in a shorter period of time. So if you want to do 4 sets of 10 on something for 40 total reps, or you want to set a 40 rep target on rest pause and you're taking a 15 or 20 RM, doing as many as you can, 20 seconds rest, as many as you can, you're going to hit that 40 total reps and your first set still uses the same top peak load. Your gain should be good over the long term. But the point is, if you have a day where you're really crunched for time, right, you can go in and do everything with these time efficient strategies. Or if you're still interested in strength, what you can do is you can go and you can work up to that first set at a top load to get your peak strength adaptation, then perform everything else with rest pause or drop sets if you can. Now, the other aspect of this is that I've always said, if we think of periodization as a long-term training strategy and the long-term trends over a year, 2 years, 3 years, how things are moving, that periodization in part dictates your programming. Meaning if I'm a powerlifter training for a meet, I am probably not looking to accumulate a lot of volume in the couple weeks before the competition. So that's not a time where I would include these time-efficient training strategies. I would probably include them more in volume blocks where I'm farther out from the meet. So there's various applications to them. But if you understand what they're trying to accomplish, which is accumulate volume in a shorter period of time, so I'm constrained for time today, I can do those, but I can still maintain my peak strength if that's my goal by doing one top set and then utilizing these other strategies. Or I'm in my periodization macro cycle and the volume blocks is probably where these are going to go. So I hope those examples help demonstrate the concept and the integration, and it really never ends. And that's what I would encourage everybody to do when they read a study, right? You might have a meta regression, and that might help inform the baseline recommendations you're giving for sets per week or something like that. But one study shouldn't do that. One study is going to be there to give you a look. You're going to have a little bit more insight into this concept and that you can apply it to things that you might not even have thought you could apply it to before.
Yeah.
Right. And that's kind of the whole goal and overarching ethos of how I've tried to approach understanding individual studies.
No, I think it's a really prescient two examples you gave because as you recall, when that research came out, it was a different era. There was very few studies on not only in powerlifters, but on programming in powerlifters that was longitudinal that we could actually action. And at that time, the science was so scant in the space that it was very common for people to go, I'm going to take literally that study design and I'm going to turn that into a program or try to shoehorn it into what I'm doing. And people trying to use AMRAPs actually came out of that study and then, I'm going to have a running predicted 1RM on a regular basis. And I'm going to do AMRAPs at 80 or 85, 90% of my 1RM all the time. And it didn't work that well in many of the very rigid ways that it was applied because they weren't really understanding the overarching concept. So I think, that was critical, I think, for a lot of people in that era to move away from doing the DUP to going, so I want to be fresh when I do my most important performance, but I still want to get through all of my volume. So let me think about how things are ordered.
Should I still make my ebook or did I miss my chance on that?
Ebooks are, from what I've heard, there's only one ebook worth buying out there anyway.
What if you had a version, like a second or a third version?
Yeah, you can absolutely write the one good ebook, and then you can write a second or third edition of it.
Okay, that would be the way to go.
Only way to go.
But if you haven't written the first one yet,
Can't
probably shouldn't start now.
Yeah.
Okay.
That's another thing you can learn from the research on the order of numbers. I believe that's called mathematics.
Okay. Interesting.
He cut me. He was gonna have me review the third edition of his ebooks, and he cut me from the reviewer roster just because he's been seeing me fall asleep at inappropriate times and visibly fall apart as my workload has increased. So he framed it as an act of mercy, but I've never been more offended.
Trucks.
Here's Spencer.
Yeah, it is. There's a lot of offensiveness coming from over here. He tries to hide it under this guise of,
Let me do you a favor and completely stab you in the back and hurt your career.
the first version of the books, I've heard, people are saying that they read them. But a lot of people say they read Super Training, but have they?
No one got through Super.
So
There are pages of that book that not a human has seen.
right.
Yeah.
But in those books, there was a foreword for those books from,
It's still there in the second edition too.
is it going to be in the third?
There won't be any forwards in the third because I've outgrown the need for forward.
We call that getting cut, Mike.
That's how that goes. I got, it's like Major League when you get a red tag on your locker and you got cut from the team.
There you go. So to bring it back to another aspect of science communication, Lauren, I've seen you make a lot of content lately. So you've made a lot of content specifically for women related to whether or not they should train differently in different phases of their menstrual cycle, whether they need to train differently after they no longer have a menstrual cycle, or whether just broadly do women need to train in a fundamentally different way than men. Now, it's not that this data is based on nothing. It's not like you're just myth busting in the traditional sense of ridiculous fitness claim. No, that's not true. Please don't do that. More so, It's that the data that's being used to support some of this contention is perhaps not the best fit. And you can even shoehorn this into thinking that, well, why would you say that? This is data on the hormones, which change during these phases or differ between people. So therefore, of course it should be different. The testosterone level in women and men is drastically different. Going through menopause is drastically different to having it. The luteal phase is drastically different from, So I would love to hear from you, like, what is the particular issue that you take with the way a lot of this has been positioned? And is there an overarching concept that comes from that people can learn from so they don't make the same error over and over?
I think it's a really difficult time to be consuming this content on social media because everyone is putting in a PubMed ID and everyone is saying, well, so-and-so shared the research to support it. And so in some ways, we would hope that everyone would be doing that in a legitimate way. But unfortunately, it doesn't always seem to be the case. And it's difficult to consume that and to know, hey, does this particular citation actually support the message I'm putting out there? Is this the type of evidence that we would even use to support a practical message of how should I train or how should I diet? And one thing that I think is really misunderstood generally is the types of papers that are producing data that we can cite as, hey, here's the evidence. For example, some people will cite many, many narrative reviews, which are opinion papers with references that the author chooses to include to support their opinion. Not that these aren't important or good to have in the literature, but as somebody who's consuming this content, it's really important to be able to say, hey, if all of these references to support this claim are essentially opinion papers and no one seems to be able to cite a clinical trial or meta-analysis of clinical trials with data looking at this intervention versus that intervention and what happened in human subjects, then that's a problem. And we shouldn't be jumping the gun to making new recommendations or different recommendations. The same goes for short-term kind of mechanistic studies and rodent model data. All of these are important and all of these build together a body of literature, but those rodent model data, the mechanistic stuff, the short-term acute studies, these are all good for generating hypotheses that you then go on to test in various stages. And it's important that before we make any exercise or nutrition recommendation to humans or women or older individuals, that we actually have the data in human subjects to say, yes, I put you through this program or this nutritional strategy, and I put you through this other program or this other nutritional strategy, and we saw a difference that is meaningful enough to say, I'm going to change the recommendation. And that's not happening right now. There's a lot that's going on that is muddying the water.
And importantly, Lauren, it can happen. Like, this is an area where we're going, all right, we have this population, we have this population. We could put them through a training protocol. We could put them through a nutrition protocol. We could do that for a length of period of time where we would expect to see adaptations. And we could actually do multi-site data collection to see if there's a sufficient sample size to observe a difference in at least some number of the studies that would match our hypothesis. Mm-hmm. And the frustrating thing about the modern era is that you can't just take one of these sound bites and directly apply it to all research. If we look at going back to cholesterol hands, Florida man, cholesterol hands.
Thank you.
The carnivore crowd, the keto crowd, and many of the folks who have, let's say, contrarian views as to what healthy nutrition guidelines look like, love to lean on, this epidemiological data or this mechanistic data, I see that cholesterol is going down, but show me an RCT where someone followed this strict diet for 20 years and compared it to that, and we saw fewer people die. So I think one of the bigger picture concept that you're getting at is that we should always be using the best available evidence.
Yep.
And the complete picture of the evidence to make a conclusion, and that different types of research fit in an ecosystem of supporting one another. Like if we just do the applied study without the mechanistic study, you shouldn't over extrapolate as to why we think it's happening.
Right.
And this is the typical trainer flaw, right? So for example, bodybuilders during contest prep, they jack up the reps, they do a lot more volume. You know what I think high reps makes you cut? Maybe it's because you're doing more volume and more total reps and higher energy expenditure and the other things you're doing that's making you get so cut.
And the fish.
Which thins the
Thank
skin.
you. Thank you for dropping that in.
It's an important piece. So
Tilapia specifically.
exactly, if you're in the part of the world that has tilapia. If you're not, you're just not going to get shredded. So this idea that if we just use what we see in the trenches or even the applied research, and then we go out and we kind of just speculate on a whim, we know what we're seeing is actually happening, but we don't necessarily know why. And so we need the mechanistic research. But if you don't have the applied research and you go, you know what, I'm just going to rely on the mechanisms, that is like 1/10 of the physiology that is actually going on in the body. And it may or may not have a meaningful effect. And how many times do we have to make that error in exercise science from the hormone hypothesis related to, whatever jacks up growth hormone post-exercise, that's how we're going to get huge, to,
Acidic conditions. There you go.
there you go.
We solved it. The thing that I would like to take away from this is that I think our field needs more narrative reviews. Did I get that correct?
I mean,
Sure. A position stand that only cites narrative review.
There it is.
it's a narrative review of narrative review.
That would be great.
It's an umbrella narrative
Umbrella review.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Let's get on that right after this.
I think we need to have Matt's position stands citing only narrative reviews.
Or citing only mass articles.
Citing
Well, I mean, that's basically our content already.
even better. Yeah. Well, why would you want to cite anything else?
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think
Reference to the best evidence. Easy.
Yeah.
that's right. One example of this that I can just give in a practical way is fasted training. And so about a decade ago, everyone thought fasted training, hey, you oxidize more fat during that exercise, that's going to be more efficient for fat loss. Everyone should do fasted cardio. Interesting hypothesis. Turns out that didn't pan out. When you actually do the long-term trial, measuring the fat loss in response to fasted or fed state training. Now, the message being targeted at women specifically is don't do fasted training. It is going to increase your body fat accumulation. And the evidence for this is looking at chronically elevated cortisol levels, Cushing syndrome, where you do see body fat redistribution, body fat accumulation in some cases in people with a serious health condition, of which chronically elevated cortisol levels is a symptom. So you're taking science and packaging it in a narrative that's entirely inappropriate and really changing the message for how people should eat and train.
And Trex, how many times have we circled this exact well in the bodybuilding literature? We have these IFBB pros. They take massive amounts of insulin. They're huge. Therefore, why don't we have more carbohydrates post-workout? Because it's definitely the same thing, right? Or, hey, what can we do to manipulate your fat intake level to get a small bump in testosterone? Because obviously a diurnal variation that's also increased by 5% because you went to 30% of your diet from fat versus 20% is the same thing as taking 3 grams of testosterone that you're injecting into your ass. Obviously the same thing. And time again, this speculation on mechanisms that whether it's extrapolated from drug use or it's extrapolated from clinical conditions which create supraphysiological or hypo levels of any physiological, substance in our body or hormone is absolutely not the same thing as what's going on when you consume a food or you alter the timing of your training.
Yeah.
So it's an old trope, but everything is cyclical. And if you know these things, then you can pick them up and you can not necessarily get hoodwinked, as we've often said.
You see this in the supplement space a lot too, right? So one of the examples that
burner ever.
every fat burner ever, right? And to draw from our podcast we had with the great Dr. Mike Ormsby, right? Fat oxidation doesn't equal more fat loss, right? But in the supplement kind of area, I think of something like, L-arginine, and the bioavailability is quite low. But so in healthy individuals, you'd probably rather look for L-citrulline or somebody that is prehypertensive. But in individuals that have low levels of nitric oxide in these clinical conditions, L-arginine can have some beneficial effects, right? You're going to think of an anti-catabolic agent, back when even before some of that data and HMB was getting some hype, it would have to be a condition that was perhaps very demanding. I remember when I was a student, we did a forced exercise training study where rodents ran on a forced exercise wheel for maybe like 8 to 10 hours a day continuously to test HMB to see if there was effects. But the point is, those conditions would have to be present, right? To see that, right? The conditions of the low nitric oxide in these clinical patients would be present for the L-arginine. So you can take some of that data, or you can take, hey, anti-catabolic agent, and throw it out there for something. But if those conditions aren't present, then that narrative, as you're getting to, Lauren, just isn't there. You're trying to fit it into these other situations that it's just not applicable for.
That's very well said. And these complexities are all interacting, and not only that, but our field is such where even if we were to have someone who understood, okay, cool, I've got this mechanistic study and it's showing me this thing. I've got this applied study, it's showing me this. I can see how they link together. And this is a concept that I should apply. If you don't understand the limitations of single studies in the modern era of publishing as well, then you can even understand that and still get it wrong if you're not looking in a broader meta sense at the research. Now, Trex, I remember when we were first coming up and when we were all first coming up, you find a study back when you were in your bodybuilding days, and I always have been, always will be in my bodybuilding days, you'd find the one study that is about hypertrophy, about fat loss, or actually, pray tell, about bodybuilding or powerlifting, and it's like gold. And you take everything it says, and it's because there was so little research. Starting around circa 2013, we get that Rossau first case study. Now we got like 30 case studies on bodybuilders. We have meta-analyses on bodybuilders. We have labs that are actually dedicated to this type of research. And we have a whole bunch of work that's coming out on hypertrophy-oriented training or nutrition. And I think people are starting to get frustrated with science. There's even people who get mad when new studies come out because it feels like the data is flip-flopping. Science can't get it right. Is training with lengthened biased, emphasis, is it helpful or is it not? Is it the same as full range of motion training? I thought it was 1 gram per pound, or is it 0.8, or is it 1.2? So Trex, talk to me about why is it that it seems like science is flip-flopping, and what do we do about it?
Well, I think, primarily the biggest reason is the fact that, we've talked about this, I believe, on Iron Culture before. We talk too much. I forget where and when, but I believe it was on Iron Culture. But we talk a lot about sampling error or sampling variance, which inherently is going to be tightly linked to sample size. So exercise science, we're kind of perpetually complaining, is really hard to run big studies. It just is. And so we do the best with what we got. It's a generally pretty underfunded area of research, especially when you start getting into the more performance, physique, bodybuilding adjacent topics. If you can't frame your work as being directly relevant to a pertinent clinical condition, really hard to get the type of funding you need for an RCT, randomized controlled trial with 40 or 50 people per treatment arm. And then, of course, you have to have a history of funding. So you got a lab with 3 postdocs and 6 grad students, and you can hire on a nurse to do stuff. The needs and the resource intensive nature just compounds when you start looking at these big trials. So we're doing the best with what we got. We create a lot of very small studies, and the smaller a study is, the more sampling variance we expect to see. And basically what that means is anytime we do a study, we're going to grab a sample of people from a bigger population. So if Lauren's going to do a study on postmenopausal women, there's at least hundreds on the planet. And she's not going to get all hundreds of them into her lab. She's going to get, 40 maybe,
So half.
Yeah, so half.
Still, it's hundreds. It could be 200.
That's right. Yeah.
There's still like 150 people out there.
Yeah, you're only recruiting 25%.
25%. Yeah.
Yeah. So what that means is
Like in your britches there. Come on.
we're taking some liberties, right? We're going to say, I think that this group of people should generally do an okay job of representing the population they came from. And so when I calculate or observe an effect in this group, what I'm really saying is that that's about what we should expect to see in the broader group. We're using the sample estimate of the effect as a proxy for the actual true population effect. And so the smaller studies get, the worse that assumption is, and the larger liberties that we're taking. So it's not just that sample estimates can get highly variable and a bit wonky when sample sizes get low. It's not just that it can happen, it's that it should happen. And that, I think that's the biggest misconception, probably because the terms sampling variance and sampling error are kind of used interchangeably. And so when someone, I remember when I was first learning about sampling error as like an undergrad student, first year master's student, it just kind of intuitively gives you the impression, if you do small sample studies, maybe it invites you to have a greater likelihood of making some mistake, right? But it's not a mistake. This is simply the nature of, the easiest way to describe it is flipping a coin, right? So you got a coin, heads and tails. Theoretically, about half the time you should get heads, about half the time you should get tails. If you flip it twice and you get heads twice, you don't call the newspaper, right? You say, yeah, it'll even out eventually, right? And what you're saying there is basically, I need a bigger sample of observations before I start to say, this coin somehow has two heads on it and no tails, or this coin has been manipulated such that one side is heavier and it's coming up on heads every time, right? So essentially that's what we're getting at, is the fact that if we're going to do science by the process of just making it a shotgun approach volume game, and say, instead of running a few studies with 300 subjects each, we're going to run a few hundred studies with 30 subjects each.
Yep.
We should not just be open to, but actually, it would be shocking if we didn't have studies flip-flopping back and forth, because those effect estimates from these small studies should not be reliable indicators on a study-by-study basis of what the true population effect is.
That was very well summarized, and I love the analogy of flipping coins. And I think the challenge is that it's not like people interested, dear listener, in evidence-based fitness are setting up Google citation alerts and going, let me see every single study on these terms. What they're doing, and I'm not suggesting you should do that, is they're following a bunch of people like us and others and going, what are they talking about? What are their thoughts on this topic? So they're going to get a collection of some of the studies which they feel, because that's what they're being exposed to, represents the body of literature.
Yeah.
Not being aware that some people are purposely focusing on some studies because they feel, no, those methods were messed up in that one, or I don't like that one. They get someone jumping on TikTok saying, I've created a model of how hypertrophy works by these select studies from the 80s, but not these other ones, not these ones from the 90s, and I'm not interested in the meta-analysis that happened. And they tell you a cohesive narrative and it all makes sense. Or you get this impression of you're listening to maybe trying to do a good job. Maybe you're doing what we're supposed to do in American politics, is I'm going to listen to people who don't agree with me and I'm going to get a better take.
We don't do that?
I don't think we do. I don't think we do. Maybe I've just been in New Zealand too long.
Yeah.
You're right.
Don't leave you lecturing me.
I retract my...
You live here.
Right, I don't know.
Well, isn't Canada just the 51st state anyway?
I think was it going to be 51 or 50? Does Greenland come first or does Canada come first?
I think they're both in the...
I don't know the order.
It's
Okay.
a race, really.
Yeah.
So,
I don't know that Greenland gets to stay a state. I think it just is becoming absorbed.
I don't know. It's a race to see who doesn't want it the most.
who doesn't get statehood?
Who's it's like, thank God we just want to do what we want to do.
Things have changed lately, and maybe they're seeing who doesn't get there first versus gets there first. I'm not going to make any statements. I'm from New Zealand, but I will say that there are also people who are maybe trying to follow various content creators to get a survey of what do they all think. And this can create this kind of whiplash effect. It's a good thing to do to follow multiple content creators to get a spread of the information. But if they're sharing specific studies that support their position or their beliefs, and it doesn't necessarily need to be intentional or manipulative, or they're sharing the same study but giving it drastically different levels of critique because of their biases, it can feel very jarring. So not only is the information that you are getting access to not a representation of all of it, but it is also this very almost tumultuous experience of being pushed and pulled in different directions. And I think it can make people completely disengaged from the science at worst.
Yeah, if I may, I think the fact that you brought up the tumultuous nature there is really important. Something I should have clarified in my little monologue previously is that, I'm talking about how all these small studies should give us unreliable estimates of the population level effect when we're going study by study. You might listen to that and say, what are we doing here? Why would we bother? The thing I should have clarified is, in the aggregate, when we average them out, they should generally triangulate toward the true population level effect. Larger studies will tend to be closer to that than smaller studies, but assuming that there's no publication bias or other kind of biasing factors, for every major overestimate in a tiny study, we should get a major underestimate in a tiny study of that effect size. Or for every very, remarkably positive effect, a remarkably negative effect relative to the true effect size. So that's why we bother with all this, and we shouldn't just throw the small studies out. But like you said, there is a very small contingent of folks who are what we would call absolute sickos, right? They're so into it, they do set those Google alerts, right? And so the study comes along, but what we're really asking them to do is, first of all, you have to be enough of a deranged sicko that you are so into that topic, you're setting those Google alerts, and the minute a study gets published on that topic, you're on it. And we're also asking that same deranged sicko who's way too enthusiastic about this, that their reaction to that Google alert when they see that paper come by is, all right. And that's it, right? Because what we're really asking people to do, like you said, is not go find your favorite content creator who's going to cherry pick and cultivate beautiful theories for you. What we're really asking you to do is try to get a broad, a broad overview of this literature, and try not to overreact to any little given study that comes out. Try to keep assimilating them into the broader picture of this growing body of literature. And it's just the reason that it feels tumultuous to many is because they don't take that approach. And the reason that few people take that approach is, again, it requires that almost irrational level of focus and vigilance and enthusiasm, which is almost mutually exclusive from being able to, when you do get that little ping in that alert, you have to look at it and basically say, I acknowledge that and it's interesting, but in isolation, I don't care.
Yep. And I think if I can take us home with a bit of hope to kind of bridge from what you were saying, is that we're actually at a relatively exciting time in the field of actually science generally, human research, I would say, but especially in the fields of sports nutrition and sports science, where we're understanding these problems, we're vocalizing them, and where previously we were aware of the hierarchy of evidence, we weren't really good at doing the top level stuff in that hierarchy of evidence. We would say, listen, 10 years ago, we've got some issues with small sample sizes, measurement error, the data's flip-flopping, we're leaning too much on mechanistic research. So we really need to take kind of the evidence-based medicine model, incorporate it into sports science. We need to start promoting as content creators the importance of meta-analysis and systematic reviews. And then we got a rash of about a decade of not really very well done systematic reviews and meta-analyses. But today, I would say that collectively, and honestly, in large part due to people like yourself, James Steele, and a few others, thank you.
A literal tip of the cap.
And I'm literally thanking you for it, because I have been on some meta-analyses where I look back and I go, could have done a little better, different.
Me too.
Yeah, for sure.
That's never happened to me. Has that happened to you?
Or maybe you shouldn't have done a meta-analysis on 5 studies.
There was more than 5 in the one I was involved, but that is generally a true statement.
Dealing with 2.
That's unconscionable.
It's literally, it's like, how many data points do I need to just physically draw a line? 2?
2. That's the threshold.
Same thing with meta-analysis.
On our latest one that we put out, where you interviewed the great Jake Remmer on a recent live episode of Iron Culture presented by Mass, one of the comments someone left on the preprint on one of these social media websites, if you will, was you told me the effect of you can't just draw a line, any line you want on the data points to state your relationship, because that's obviously what we did.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That is, okay, so if I could just, there's something that needs to be said.
I don't have to close out the episode yet. You go for it.
Not particularly relevant at all, but worth stating a million times. So we got a similar kind of thing in our protein meta-regression where someone said, you know, there's clearly, I can visibly see a plateau, kind of a point of diminishing returns. Your linear fit is invalid because my eyeballs say it is. And first of all, being completely objective, I do not see it.
Yeah.
I just like honestly ask if you see it where, because like it's like the people who look at a constellation of 6 stars and they say, no, it's a bear fighting a lion, obviously. Like, I don't know how he filled in this diminishing returns point.
To one more, I have to say, the highest protein point fell almost directly on
Correct.
the line.
Yes.
Not in the error bar, but on the line. And
On the line.
it doesn't matter.
If we didn't make the font big enough, you wouldn't see the data point
Correct.
dissolve into the best fit line.
Yes.
But the thing that really needs to be said is if you're doing these well, folks, the data points are weighted, which means you can't just say, well, if there's 2 data points, the trend line should go between them. One of those studies should be pulling on the line more than the other. And so if you're looking at these and you're saying, you know, Zourdos' lab is full of, you know, losers and they don't know what they're doing. And
You hear that, fellas?
my brain tells me that this line is not going straight through the best fit area. It's very, very possible that what you're not accounting for is the fact that not all those data points have an equal pull on the line. And in fact, they shouldn't. So again, it's one of those areas where I'm not saying it can happen. I'm saying that generally speaking, in a meta-regression, you should have some data points that are way out in left field that are really not doing much to that fit line at all. And you want the heavier weighted studies with lower with lower levels of variance, higher sample sizes. You want those having a bigger impact on the line than all the other small sample data.
That speaks directly to the point you're making earlier with the lower number of subjects in the study, the more variance that it's going to have, and they'll be all over the place. And so it just brings it back to where you started. It's your clearest case for why you would want that weighting to exist. And how those data points in the underpowered studies are still important in the aggregate.
Yeah.
You know, it reminds me of a paper that we have interviewed now where we only have a couple subjects in one group because we had to discontinue the group. But we included those subjects because they still existed. And we wanted them to be able to go into the aggregate, but it won't weight as highly in meta-analysis.
That's an excellent point. And I think the big take-home message here is that we need meta-analysis in our field. We need large multi-site data collections to give us these sample sizes, and then we need to meta-analyze those. And the good news is we know that we need to do that. We now understand how to do it better, and I do actually have general hope for the future.
The multi-site portion of this is a key point because it ties back into something Trek said earlier about our field being underfunded. Perhaps part of the ticket to getting more funding in our area is to do multi-site data collections because it can just increase your sample size so much. It puts a research team together probably with somebody that already has funding. And from some of these agencies, they need to see that you have the right team and then you have funding, especially as younger investigators who are excited to do a lot of this work. And so with more funding should come better research to be able to control these, to be able to have more participants, to incentivize the participants, to be able to utilize more direct measures, let's say pay for MRIs for hypertrophy, things like that. So I think multi-site data collections is a big thing that I would really like to see labs join up and do in the future.
But even if we get more data, better quality data, and we are able to correctly do those meta-analyses. Just because we now have this data doesn't necessarily mean it is designed to directly inform your training program or that of your client. So to bring it all the way back to the beginning, that still applies.
Yes.
And it's really important because those studies aren't designed to tell you how to train.
Right.
And there's always going to be some individualization that needs to come into play. And so we need to do the science properly, interpret it correctly, and communicate it, but with that message and that nuanced approach.
That's designed to give you a concept.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And that's very well said. And it's essentially, I have said this many times, and this will be my little contribution for 2 minutes before we close out this podcast, that it is slightly disappointing to me that in such an applied field like nutrition and exercise science, that there is a cottage industry for something like mass. Because the target consumer of the research that we're producing is actually a trainer or an athlete or someone interested in health and fitness. It's not like a field like theoretical physics where the most blue-collar person reading it is going to be a mechanical engineer working at NASA, right? It is not science that should only be communicated to other scientists, but I think many of the structures that are in place, probably because we came from medical science and that we, have opted into the same journal structure and university structure, are such that we are essentially, in many cases, writing to other scientists. And I don't think we should be. I do think there are some papers where we absolutely should be, like some of the work that you've done, for example, where we are forming hypotheses and looking at mechanisms to then hand off the baton, per se, to an applied researcher. But I think if you're sitting in the place of applied research, applied human research for behavior, health, nutrition, training, to some degree, I think part of your job should be to communicate your work in an effective way to the public. And I know a lot of researchers are just not being trained for that.
Yeah.
Now, I'm not complaining because this is my primary income, but I hope this gets fixed at some point after we all successfully retire. But until that point, let's make slow progress that doesn't impact my wallet towards actually doing a better job as scientists to communicate our own research. I don't know. Is that fair?
You know why I'm not too worried about that happening in the near-term future is because it's maybe too much of a tangent, but universities and journals are not just not promoting and training researchers to do that. They actively put up roadblocks where it's like, if you're spending a lot of time as a professor doing science communication to practitioners, they're like, what are you doing? You're distracted. You're not focused. You need to get back in the lab.
You have a course release to write a grant this semester. I want that grant out.
Yeah.
Right. And then in the next few years, I need that grant funded. Remember, if you're a university professor, especially doing these big trials, let's say in Canada, tier 1, or in the United States, an R1, you have limited time to get this done, right? You're going to have 5 years after that. You're going to submit for tenure and hopefully you'll be successful after 6 years. So in your first 3 years, you have to get some smaller funding, right? Maybe foundation grants, maybe if you're looking in an NIH and R15 or an R21, and then you're going to go for that R01 or whatever it might be. But the pressure is on. And the opportunity cost of doing that. So it is discouraged in that way.
No, you're right, because there are some cases like you talked about where it's explicitly discouraged. It's not your job. I don't want you doing that. It's a distraction. And historically, even you guys heard of the Sagan effect? So historically, there was this, so Carl Sagan did not get into First, he didn't get tenure, and then he didn't get acknowledged or accepted into a specific society of scientists, despite, in retrospect, looking at his publication record being on par or better of other members. And it was because other scientists felt that he wasn't a serious scientist because he's the modern day Neil deGrasse. Neil deGrasse Tyson is the modern day Carl Sagan, basically.
I've now studied under Sagan.
He did. He was his doctoral student,
Yeah.
and he was taught the importance of science communication. Now, here's the thing. That is fortunately changing. And there are many more people who are being encouraged by their university, in some cases, but not all, to do science communication. But even when that is happening, and I'll actually give a shout out to AUT, research impact is the thing now. There's less of a focus on number of publications, but I want you to demonstrate how you actually took this research and put it out there and made an impact. And they're figuring out what those metrics are, but it's not just your like what's the impact factor of the journals you're published in, et cetera.
Sure.
What's your H-index is not the only thing now. And even H-index is changing how it ranks things. But that hasn't changed. They are saying, I need you to get out there and do all this stuff. By the way, I'm going to cut your pay, give you more hours, and you need to get all this shit done. So I think there is going to come a reckoning where more and more people in academia are realizing that there is an industry in doing things that doctors do, whether it's writing books, having podcasts, or all the stuff that we see in the fitness space that enables them to do good work that they feel good about and put science out there. But maybe they're getting more and more distance from the actual act of producing science. So this is an evolving space, and it's really interesting. And I do think that there are going to be some universities that are more agile than others that figure this out. And I think we're going to see some very large changes in education and academia and science in the next decade, as well as the fitness space and any space that's affected by the science communication process.
Those changes are inevitable.
Yeah.
When it happens, how it happens, what kind of pocket of universities or country or area does it first, it's going to be difficult to say, but it is going to happen. Also, I'll also say that Sagan is in good company not getting tenure initially because neither did Indiana Jones. And
That's a very good point.
I don't know if you've read some of those tenure letters that are out there on Indiana Jones, but he was never at his office hours. He was not responsive to students. He was unprofessional. He was outside of the lab all the time on expeditions that weren't approved by the university.
Yes, it is true. Not all famous science communicators are doing a good job.
Right.
Because the last time I checked, theft is not actually the same thing as doing historical research.
Yes.
And there are specific scenes from the documentaries on Indiana Jones where he's being chased by the indigenous population while he is stealing from them. Mm-hmm. And I just don't think that was appropriate, even at that time.
It wasn't. I would have voted against him.
Yeah.
Yeah, if I was on that promotion and tenure committee, it would have been tough, but I would have had to vote against him.
Yeah. If he had his bullwhip, I might have been swayed, but...
Even then.
And the revolver? And the hat.
No, the hat, I mean, that's when we're official, right?
That I used.
Think about that. Yeah, he flies through. Probably unanimous vote at that level.
I will say you guys would be absolutely starstruck because now that I'm in evolutionary anthropology, a lot of people that I work with now do actual like field work, and they do kind of get all dressed up in their Indiana Jones outfits.
Wow.
You work with Dr. Jonas.
I work with people who work with him.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
But yeah, there's full-blown expeditions and, people, put on the whole tan outfit with the hat to protect them from the sun. They go out there digging for fossils. And every now and then there will be a email out to the listserv that says, I've got a tent if anybody wants it. Smells of goat urine. And whoever wants it can come pick it up.
That's pretty exciting, honestly.
Out there digging for fossils sounds like me in the closet of the lab digging for the last tub of ultrasound gel. So before I have to order more.
Yeah, that is the closest thing I do to archaeology is trying to find more ultrasound gel.
I'll never get used to it. I'll go down to the mail because I still do the stuff I do, right? So I'll go down in the mail room. I ordered some test tubes to come in, and there will be just like a wooden crate that literally looks like it's out of Indiana Jones, and it'll just say like Neanderthal teeth, do not touch. And I'm like, what's happening?
It's amazing.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, that makes sense because like if you're in any exercise science lab, there was some PhD student who had like a custom built thing to modify the isokinetic dynamometer. They finish. You have that there for the next 20 years. Yeah. You forget what it is. The student of the student of the student isn't even there anymore. And now it's in the corner and you're like, oh yeah, that was like a neck brace for that neck training study we did back in 1985.
But you can't use it because the BioPack machine you have is interfaced with a computer that only has DOS and
you need to run on a Windows 95.
Correct.
Yeah, exactly. Well, that tangent turned into 10 tangents, dear listener, but we hope you enjoyed it. If you made it to this deep in the podcast anyway, we know you're a loyal, diehard Iron Culture presented by Mass fan, but we just want to say from the bottom of our hearts collectively that we appreciate you listening. We're having a ton of fun out here in Austin, and not only is this episode going to come out, but we're going to have Front Page Fitness dropping pretty soon after this one drops, and I'm going to even hint that we might start doing other things on YouTube that may involve some people who you might not think would be maybe on YouTube.
Interesting.
Is it interesting, Mike?
It is interesting. What's most interesting to me is that you said we were having a ton of fun out here. Who's having fun? I don't want to be here.
I would say 3/4 of the company is having a great
Yeah, I don't want to be here.
And according to HR, who had a meeting right now, that's the threshold where we think the company's having fun.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
Mike, never meet your heroes and never ever meet your colleagues. That's what they say.
Yeah.
And this meetup, the first meetup in mass history, I think proves that.
I think it clearly showed that. And I'm going to go so far to call it the first and last.
the first and last
First and
meeting
last.
of mass. And dear listener, you got to see it and you are a part of history, the end of a history, but the beginning of maybe some more siloed functions where we just hang out with parts of the people we like and shift it around so we can maintain a dysfunctional company culture. So if you like this episode of Iron Culture, please give it a like, please give it a share, and make sure you tune in next week. We might have a live episode. We might have a pre-recorded one. Who knows? We're flying by the seats of our collective pantsuses, which is the plural form of pants, and we'll see you in the next episode.